23 second-rate German divisions, reservists with no tanks, no air cover, and a half-built concrete wall were all that stood between the French army and the industrial heart of the Third Reich in September 1939. 90 French divisions faced them, and a single decision to attack could have ended the war by Christmas, before the death camps, before the conquest of Europe, before the Holocaust ever became possible. In our timeline, that attack never truly came. France advanced 5 miles into the Saar, captured a few villages, and then turned around and marched home. A token gesture, dressed up as an offensive, but Germany's best soldiers were 1,000 kilometers east, drowning Poland under bombs and panzers. The Siegfried Line garrisons had no heavy weapons, and German generals would later admit they could not have stopped a serious assault. The door to Berlin was open. In this telling, France walks through it. On September 7th, General Maurice Gamelin does not hesitate. He does not advance 5 miles into Germany, capture a handful of empty villages, and then quietly pull his men back home, as he did in reality. Instead, he gives the word that the German High Command privately feared most. Full advance, all reserves committed. Objective the Saar coal basin and the Rhine beyond it. The guns open up before dawn near Saarbrücken, and the French army pours across the frontier in numbers the German garrison cannot even count, let alone stop. What happened next was not a battle, it was a collapse. The Siegfried Line, the famous west wall that Nazi propaganda had painted as impregnable, was in September 1939 a hollow promise. Whole sections had no guns mounted in their bunkers. The men holding it were older reservists who had been told reinforcements would arrive once Poland fell. They did not arrive. The French rolled past the strongpoints, surrounded them, and left them to wither while the main columns drove deeper into German soil. If you're already gripped by how close this moment really was, take a second to subscribe and tell me in the comments which forgotten turning point you want me to bring to life next, because this was the secret that German generals would confess only after the war. They could not have held. Their best armies, their panzer divisions, their entire striking force were 1,000 kilometers to the east, grinding through Poland. The West was a bluff, and France had just called it. In Berlin, the news arrived like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Hitler, who had gambled everything on the certainty that the French would do nothing, now faced the one thing his entire strategy could not survive: a real two-front war, with his finest soldiers trapped on the wrong front. He screamed at his generals. He demanded the impossible: bring the army back from the Vistula, hold the Rhine, save the Saar. But trains move at the speed of trains, and the Wehrmacht spearheads were too deep into Poland to turn around in time. By the 3rd week of September, the French had taken the Saar coal basin. This was not a symbolic prize. It was the beginning of the end. Just to the north lay the Ruhr, the smoking, roaring industrial heart of Germany, the source of nearly 2/3 of the nation's coal and steel. Without the Ruhr, German factories could not forge tanks. Without coal, the railways could not run. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's aircraft sat grounded on their airfields like ornaments. The whole machine of conquest depended on a strip of land that French tanks were now approaching from the south. And the German generals understood, perhaps better than Hitler ever could, exactly what that meant. There is a strange irony buried in this moment. The men who had cheered the invasion of Poland, who had drawn up the plans and saluted on the parade grounds, were the same men who now whispered among themselves in the corridors of the army headquarters. Some of them had opposed the war from the start, convinced that Germany was not yet ready, that Hitler's recklessness would bring ruin. In our timeline, those officers stayed silent, because the gamble paid off. In this one, the gamble had failed in the most public, most catastrophic way imaginable, and silence was no longer an option. By the second month, French armored columns reached the edge of the Ruhr. The factories began to go quiet, not from bombs, but from arithmetic. There was simply no longer enough coal to feed the furnaces. The great chimneys that had blackened the sky over Essen and Dortmund for half a century stood cold against the autumn light. Workers were sent home. Officers found themselves rationing fuel that should have been limitless. And in the east, the Polish campaign that should have been a triumph turned into a desperate, exhausting scramble to disengage and race westward across a ruined continent. It was in the cold weeks of that first war winter that the regime cracked. Picture the scene without picturing the violence. A group of senior officers, men in field grey with iron crosses earned in the last war, gathering in a quiet room far from the cameras and the rallies. They had seen the maps. They knew the Ruhr was lost. They knew that a Germany without steel could not fight, and a Germany that could not fight had no use for the man who had led it into this trap. What followed was not announced on the radio with fanfare. It was announced in the careful, bloodless language of men who had decided that the experiment was over. Hitler was removed, whether by exile, by arrest, or by something quieter. The new men in Berlin did not say. The settlement that followed reshaped the century in a single stroke. Germany withdrew from Poland. The annexation of Austria was placed under negotiation. The armies in the east, exhausted and stranded, marched home not as conquerors, but as survivors of a war that had lasted barely 4 months. There would be no spring offensive in 1940. No tanks pouring through the Ardennes, no fall of Paris, no occupation, no government in Vichy bending its knee to a master in Berlin, and the machinery of horror that, in our timeline, was only just beginning to turn. The camps, the trains, the systematic darkness that would consume millions, never received the years it needed to grow. The most terrible chapter of human history was closed before its first full page was written. Consider what this absence means. A Europe where the great cities of the East were never reduced to rubble, where the Red Army never marched west because there was no shattered Germany to march into, and so the Iron Curtain never fell across the continent. The Cold War, the decades-long standoff that defined the lives of billions, either never arrives or arrives in a form so altered we would scarcely recognize it. The superpowers that emerged from the ashes of total war remain, instead, simply great nations among others. The old empires of Europe, which were bankrupted and broken by 6 years of fighting, linger on for another generation, for better and for worse, all of it, the entire architecture of the world we inherited, turning on a single week in September, on 23 tired divisions and a wall that could not hold, on one general choosing to gamble rather than to wait. In the world we actually live in, France advanced 5 miles, paused, and walked home. The window closed. The best army in Europe stood behind its fortifications and waited for a war that came to it on terms of its enemies' choosing. History rarely offers a clean second chance, but in September 1939, for a few short weeks, it laid one on the table, undefended, almost begging to be taken. And the most haunting truth of all is this: the door was never locked. It was only that no one was willing to walk through it.